I am Executive Director of Hyperledger, focused on blockchain technologies. I have a really deep background in open source software. I think I installed my first piece of open source in fall of 1991 as an undergraduate at UC Berkeley. And from that point forward, have spent most of my life building open source software communities and companies around that, and then working at places like the White House and the World Economic Forum in trying to build open source culture, open source collaboratives to go out and solve real problems, not just technology problems, but society problems as well. And that's what drew me into the blockchain space. It wasn't so much programmable money or ICOs or Lamborghinis. It was really more the opportunity to address, the fact that with the centralization of the internet, we were putting a lot of trust and risk into the hands of a very small number of organizations. And the ability to use this technology to address that trust issue and the gap in, the Edelman Trust Survey that was mentioned was really a big opportunity. And so for the last 3 years, I've been leading this project. The project's a little bit older, about 3.5 years old. So what I thought I would do is kind of tell you about the side of the blockchain space that we focus on, a little bit about how Hyperledger and the Linux Foundation work, some of the projects that we're building, and ways for you to get involved. So let me first start. All of you are here because you know about this B word. Many of you know about the cryptocurrency background for it. But we've kind of chosen from the beginning to focus on a different way of using these underlying technologies. These underlying technologies being the concept of a distributed ledger. And then once you have that, the ability to automate all sorts of business processes between organizations in the form of smart contracts. And this idea of a distributed ledger is, in my opinion, more disruptive than even the idea of a cryptocurrency. This idea of a database that is write-only, that has witnesses to every transaction, who confirm the transaction, actually not just that they saw the transaction, but that it meets certain properties, like you can't allow somebody to spend the same token twice. This is a very intriguing invention. This is something that I think was made most famous by its application in Bitcoin, and thank you, Satoshi, for using that word, blockchain. But I think many of these concepts go back to older ideas around distributed processing and transaction systems and distributed computing that now we've been able to put into a real package and understand how to use. But this idea of this immutable shared ledger is something that I think the world is really crying out for today. And many people, I think, and this was perhaps more disruptive 3 years ago when we started talking about this than it is now, but many people believed, there's going to be one blockchain. You perhaps have heard the used in front of the word blockchain as if there was only one, kind of like the internet. Well, it turns out that there are many different ways that you would deploy blockchain technology and many different opinions out there about how governance should work on a given blockchain ledger. So it really made sense to start thinking about lots of different distributed ledgers out there being woven together into kind of a patchwork, kind of a quilt, if you will, of many different kinds of networks. And many of these networks will talk to each other, and you might have some overlay networks dealing with identity or dealing with payments. But at its core, if you're talking about a blockchain network to solve issues around asset tracking or trade finance or know your customer applications or healthcare applications, it's really right to think about how do we build these networks as the way that you would build consortia, or the way that you would build communities. If anything, you could say that blockchain technology is an operating system for consortia. It's a way to automate and systematize the types of business processes that consortia deal with every day. And that we don't have to try to boil the ocean and solve all problems that every possible consortium of businesses would have all at once, right? That there's actually a pretty broad range here a spectrum, if you will, that you could apply blockchain technology against, ranging from public, anonymous, and permissionless networks, such as the major cryptocurrency networks, Bitcoin and Ethereum, to the other end of the spectrum being permissioned networks of, say, a half dozen or a dozen different organizations who simply amongst themselves want to have a system of record, a ledger to track transactions, and a way of guaranteeing the integrity of those transactions and the verifiability of them. And in between the two, you have a lot of interesting middle ground, right? You have, for every network, the larger you can grow it, the more participants on that network, the more valuable that network is. But if you grow it too quickly and you have too many participants in who aren't quite either vetted or have a stake in the system, then you run the risk of spam, or you run the risk of bad actors in the system potentially corrupting the process. But if you can find ways technologically to be able to manage those phenomena, you can have bigger and bigger permission networks. I think we are also starting to see the rise of permissioned public networks. And an example would be the Sovereign Foundations network that's running now in production for verifying identity credentials. But you also could see this applied to certain types of data that by their nature are public data, right? Things like land titles or other types of, or business registrations, other types of data where there's really a public interest in having this data be known, but where the authorized entities to publish to it are more named. And the interesting thing about this is, you know, on the left-hand side, you have a lot of advantages, right, in terms of being super easy to connect to and verify transactions and that sort of thing. But you also pay a price in terms of performance, in terms of needing to use algorithms like proof of work that consume a lot of energy. And the further you go to the right-hand side, to permissioned and private, the higher transaction rate you can support, the more there's other kinds of consensus mechanisms that are not about burning a lot of CPU power that are really much more efficient. And so I think that's one reason we're going to see this world of many different ledgers out there. You've already heard about the Edelman Trust Survey. This is kind of the, you know, it's been going on for 20 years, so this is not a sudden realization that nobody trusts institutions anymore. But it's remarkable how much across the entire, across the world, you know, people don't trust institutions anymore. They don't trust politicians. Maybe that's not news. But they don't even trust lawyers and doctors. They don't trust brands anymore. And technology, the internet, hasn't really solved this. It's only made it easier to find fault with institutions, find fault with our neighbors, right? So we need technologies that can help reestablish and help us understand who can we trust and how much can we trust them. And that's where blockchain technology really fits in. If anything, blockchain is a trust machine. That cover of The Economist that was shown earlier, that was inspirational. In 2015, when I saw that, I was like, okay, there's something more here than just a speculative, you know, cryptocurrency frenzy. There's something deep. And so this is really the best way to think of this technology, is as a platform for auditing, a platform for integrity, and a platform for building trust amongst communities. We see ourselves at Hyperledger very much focused on the implementation side of building the trust machine. There's a lot of hard questions to answer when it comes to governance models of these networks, when it comes to the standards that those networks might deploy between these different networks. There are other smart people working on those hard problems. What we are aiming to do, like all good open source projects, is focus on delivering software that runs the gamut from super experimental laboratory kinds of R&D projects all the way to enterprise solid systems that people can trust. So let me talk a little bit more about who Hyperledger is. We are part of the Linux Foundation. The Linux Foundation, I'll talk about it in a bit, is a much larger organization that's been around for about 15 years. We are a collaboration between hundreds of different companies, as well as nonprofits, universities, government agencies, all working together as an open source project to develop these underlying building blocks to deploy all these different kinds of things. The Linux Foundation is a pretty broad broad operation. We started with the Linux operating system and started by focusing on bringing together the developer community around Linux, answering that question of what happens if Linus Torvalds is hit by a bus? Does the Linux project continue? The good news is it does. Good news even for Linus, right? And then answering the question, how do you build the commercial ecosystem on top so that everybody can benefit from it? Anybody from startups to companies that are mid-sized and growing, like the Red Hats of the world, to very large companies like Intel or HP or IBM, but also not just to technology companies, to end user organizations as well. So let me just give you a very brief overview of the different technology building blocks that are here. There are 12 different technology projects. The one that perhaps most of you or some of you have heard of is Hyperledger Fabric. Fabric is essentially an operating system for DLT, for distributed ledgers. When you build a Fabric-based network, everybody runs a copy of Fabric. You point it at a common certificate authority, and then you know who else is on your network, and you can start exchanging transactions that way with everybody else on that network. Fabric is joined in the Hyperledger community by competitors of itself. A project called Hyperledger Sawtooth. Sawtooth is different from Fabric, and in the time available, I don't have really a chance to go in other to say it's kind of like the difference between SQL databases like MySQL or Postgres and NoSQL databases like MongoDB or Cassandra. We also have projects like Hyperledger Indy, really focused on distributed digital identity. Projects like Hyperledger Burrow, focused on integration with the Ethereum ecosystem, especially being able to run Ethereum smart contracts. Projects that focus on cryptography and zero-knowledge proof systems, like Hyperledger Ursa, and a project to benchmark your blockchain networks called Hyperledger Caliper. As I mentioned, we're really focused on building software, and that means taking a very pragmatic approach to the design, to the way that we work. Everything has to be public. Everything has to be built on common community infrastructure. Often these projects start internally at a company who then propose it to the Hyperledger community. It gets reviewed and approved by a group of developers known as the Technical Steering Committee. But once it comes in, the expectation is that every project becomes a multi-vendor and multi-developer project. The idea is not that, say, IBM owns Fabric or Intel owns Sawtooth or Soramitsu owns Iroha or any of these kinds of things where that's where the project comes from, but that eventually we get it to the point where multiple companies, multiple developers are contributing to it. As I mentioned, it's also important to be building the commercial ecosystem on top of this. And so now, 3 years in, one of the real highlights of this past year was seeing Hyperledger Fabric deployed as a managed service across every major cloud in the world. So the ones that you know about, like AWS and Google Cloud and Microsoft Azure, to the vendor-specific ones like IBM's cloud, SAP, and Oracle's, as well as the major cloud providers in China, Tencent, Baidu, Ali, and Huawei, are all offering Fabric and soon some of the other technologies as a managed service, making the cost and the simplicity of deploying these super low, right? Making it super easy to build these networks. Just earlier this week, Forbes published an overview of the top 50 enterprise blockchain networks that are in production today, like many of the ones that you've heard earlier. And of those 50, 29 of them are running on top of Hyperledger Fabric, which is really cool to see. Involved in this project are companies not just like those you see in the cloud providers, but some of the kind of companies that in different industries play this integrated kind of consortium role, such as DTCC, who handle most of the actual stock certificates on Wall Street and other types of core securities, or Swift is another example of these. But you also see major end user organizations like Daimler and Airbus and Deutsche Bank involved in using these technologies at a pretty core level. But there's hundreds of different organizations, from banks to startups in the healthcare space and large healthcare providers to people using this to disrupt education. I mean, all sorts of different industries. It's really fun. Let's see, sorry. Let me give you just a few quick examples. There we go. There's a deployment of Hyperledger on a platform called, being run by a company called Circular, who deployed a supply chain traceability system for rare earth metals coming out of Central Africa, in particular in Rwanda, where there are certified mines producing tantalum and other core ingredients for batteries. And you have companies like Apple who care quite a bit about being able to guarantee to their customers that the batteries and the other minerals used in the production of iPhones come from sources that are certified to not employ slave labor. This is now a network in production, and it's being used to certify the production of these materials hitting, when they make their way to factories in China and then eventually into consumer products. So this is really cool to see. Once you have a healthy supply chain network and with a lot of data flowing about who the actors are and who's providing that data, you can build a trade finance system on top of that. So another example of a deployment here is the Development Bank of Singapore worked with a small nonprofit, small for-profit called DLT Ledgers and a large company called AgriCorp to build a trade finance network around supply chain, around the supply chain in agricultural goods in Southeast Asia. This has only been live for 2 months as of the time this data was collected in December, and already they had processed $750 million in trade value in letters of credit and in the settlement of delivery of goods, involving 4,500 different farmers in Australia initially in this pilot. So that $2 trillion number that you saw projected for 2021, I think we're going to see that number potentially hit much sooner than that. In fact, there's another trade finance network operating in China already doing over 1 billion Chinese renminbi per day, which is about $160 million US. So lots of stuff happening. Another example, I mean, there's hundreds of examples I could give, but the one that I felt might be interesting really to people here is in another one in China, called the Legal X chain. So in China, they have 3 internet court systems. These internet courts allow you to open a case, have it heard, present evidence, have it decided, and have it enforced all virtually. You never have to show up in an actual physical court. When they launched this, there was a lot of concern about corruption of the evidence that would be presented and whether documents would be modified, by parties who had access to the servers. So the court system has set up a blockchain-based system for tracking of that evidence, making sure it's not tampered as it's being delivered, making sure you have all the evidence collected and not just a subset, right, that meets somebody's interests. This is now in production in 3 different states in China and is planned for rollout to the rest of them, and is already tracking 15 million documents in the system in about a year of being in an operation. Blockchain technology is really about not just transparency and not just digital transformation, but about accountability. I think for many of us in this space, it's about how do we get to make the world more auditable, to fight corruption, to fight fraud, but to really help reestablish that digital tools as a means to building society as a community rather than depending upon central actors to do that for us. So we're really excited about the way these technologies are being used out there, and we really want you to get involved. So feel free, please, to come to the Hyperledger website, learn more about what we're doing. Even if you're not a developer, even if you just want to understand how these technologies work and who you can hire to help you build them, we're here to help. So thank you very much.